our final informative session of the day. Obviously, there will be a couple more things after the session, but I did want to have an opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Ryan Hoff. I'm the General Counsel and Director of Government Relations for AIC, one of the primary lobbyists for AIC as well as staff attorney. Again, like David mentioned before, I'm not your individual attorney. I represent the association, so make sure you get to have a good working relationship with your county attorney to handle specific legal advice for you and your office. I can certainly be a resource and am happy to discuss general legal topics with you all if you have a question that comes up. But again, I am not your individual attorney, your office's attorney. I work a ton with the AIC Legislative Committee, which is comprised of appointees from each of your respective affiliate offices. So the clerks have, your affiliate has an appointment, the recorder's affiliate has an appointment, so on. That's how the policy is made for AIC in the broader sense. On the legislative front, the Legislative Committee adopts the legislative platform every single year, updates it to reflect current issues, and then that gives us our marching orders to go to the State House and try to achieve those goals. Today I wanted to introduce our next speakers, John McKnight and Libby Roberts. Libby is an attorney with the law firm of Church, Hiddle, and Antrim. John is president and CEO of Bliss McKnight, who is the AIC endorsed vendor for property casualty and liability insurance. They've been a great partner for AIC and in protecting counties and educating county officials for over 30 years now, right? Over 30 years, they've been an endorsed vendor. So certainly appreciate their guidance and assistance. And I know they're going to have a lot of interesting information for you on starting up your respective offices. So with that, John McKnight.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, and it's good to be in front of county audience again. I always find these kinds of meetings are very helpful for us to understand what your interests and concerns are, and hopefully we can present to you information and ideas and a few rules. They aren't our rules, they're generally federal government's rules, to help you stay out of trouble. And being in this position, one of the things that people ask us fairly often is what kind of trends are going on, particularly in liability of local government officials, and of course you're interested in what's going on with counties. And make sure I can get this going. Evolving trends, there's lots of things to worry about in the liability area, but there's some good news too. The judicial environment is improving. No matter how you feel about presidential politics, the current administration's appointment of judges generally is moving the needle towards judicial appointments that are more friendly to counties and to governments in general, and particularly to law enforcement. It isn't an instant overnight change because there's an awful lot of judges that have been appointed by prior administrations, but it happens that the current administration has a very large number of slots to fill, and they are filling them about as rapidly as the U.S. Congress or the Senate can act, which isn't always real fast, but they're getting the job done. So that's improving. It's improving in that the judges and justices of the Supreme Court that are being appointed and eventually confirmed by the Senate tend to have a temperament that's more sympathetic to the kinds of things that you have to do as government officials to make counties work. But even if you get new appointees, many of these people are judges for the first time, and they aren't always real good at it at the beginning, and so They make mistakes. Some of them are timid. There is a inclination that has been, hopefully we're getting past it, an inclination to not want to try cases, that they essentially want everybody to settle a case, which means that they believe that there's value to every claim that's made against a government. We don't happen to agree with that, and we try a great number of cases, and that is improving. So the willingness of courts to try cases, to allow you to have your day in court if you need it, is going up, and the people who are making decisions about the law, the new appointees tend to be more favorable towards what it is you have to do to make things work than prior administration appointees. Another thing that's happened is, as you all know, the economy is better. And you're all new to your positions, and many of you are new to office, but when the economy took the big slide beginning in 2007 and then accelerated by the housing crisis in 2008, and then taking forever to get back to a growth spurt, austere budgets are not good for liability. Everything gets worse liability-wise when the money is short. When you think about it, it makes sense. You have reduced staffing, you have turnover that you're not allowed to replace office holders or staff. You allow maintenance to be deferred. You have labor relations problems because nobody's getting raises. The citizenry isn't very happy in a bad economy. But as the economy picks up and money begins to flow again, you have the opportunity to go back and correct all the things that kind of got shorted during the bad economy. And we would certainly urge that you do that as opposed to spend new money on new things. There's a lot of deferred things that need to be fixed. We've seen a lot of deferred maintenance, for instance, on roads. And roads are, particularly in counties, tend to be high-speed roads where people can get into trouble with accidents if the roads aren't in good shape. You have the opportunity to replace old equipment with new, which is more efficient, less prone to breakdown, and safer. So that is also good news. One of the real troubling things, and I think you're all aware of, and if you're not, you soon will be, that the environment is hostile and unfair. And not just to local government officials, but to just about everybody. The whole idea of presumption of innocence until there's some kind of a due process for many people has gone by the boards. And as public officials and very visible people, that'll be applied to you. And there's not much any of us can do about it other than being tough and standing up to it, but that's today's reality. But the trend, if somebody said, what trend bothers you the most that you're seeing going on? It's opioids. And opioids have a much more pervasive impact on local governments than a lot of people realize. And everybody knows that opioids are a new drug in the environment, and there's lots of people becoming hooked on opioids. But when it gets into your workforce and then it gets into what it is that you as counties have to do, it gets much, much more complicated. Indiana has an issue with opioids, and this has to do with opioid prescriptions. So it's when the legitimate opioids are prescribed by a doctor to an individual. And if you look at prescribing rates in the United States, the darker the state, the worse the problem. And as you'll notice, Indiana is the second to darkest color. And you look at the prescribing rates for opioids by county, and again, the darker colors are worse. You can see that it's a very widespread problem. If you look at the 2017 year, there were 73 prescriptions for opioids per 100 people in Indiana. That's a bunch of opioids. And the numbers may be a little bit too small. Maybe that's just as well of what the prescription rates are by county. But again, no county is really coming out without a problem. The ones that don't have numbers in them didn't report their numbers. But these are prescriptions that are required by law for prescribers and pharmacies and hospitals to report to the federal government how many of these pills they've been pushing out. And it's a lot. Now, the good news is if I would have shown you the 2016 year, the number for Indiana would have been 83 prescriptions per 100 residents. Now, obviously not 83 out of 100 people are getting, or 73 out of 100 people are getting a prescription. Lots of people are getting multiple prescriptions. When you consider that you can become addicted to an opioid in 5 days, this is a big problem. Now, one of the things that's happened and one of the things that the federal government has done is they finally began to clamp down on the overprescribing of opioids. And so what we've lost in terms of trying to keep track of this thing is a good index, because the doctors now are prescribing fewer opioids than they have in the past. And we used to identify the problem and quantify the problem based on how many prescriptions are being made. But if the federal government is tamping that all down, then that no longer becomes a really good measure. So we have switched what we look at in terms of where the problem's likely to be to a drug called naloxone, which you may have heard. It's sold under the brand name Narcan. And one of the things that it does is if you squirt it up somebody's nose who's in an overdose situation, it reverses the problem. It's quite amazing. I mean, the people can be almost gone, and they get this medicine shot up their nose like a nasal spray, and what happens is they revive. And what it does is it blocks the receptors in your brain from absorbing the effects of the opioids. And now we're finding it very widely distributed. It's in a lot of first responders have it, a lot of police, a lot of fire departments, rescue squads, and also hospitals have it. And it's being also in jails. So one of the things we look at is, well, where is naloxone being administered? And that also is tracked. Now, this is only tracked by official people administering naloxone, and you can now go to the drugstore and get naloxone without a doctor's prescription. So a lot of people who think they're going to come in contact with people in an OD state, like families, are having their own naloxone at their homes and administering themselves. That is not in the record that I'm going to show you. Now, this is what's on the screen is what's called a heat map, and what it amounts to is the more intense the color, the more naloxone injections have been given in that particular location. Now, this is just the last 30 days in Indiana. If you look at what's happened year to date, you can see it's much broader problem. And the thing that's really interesting about this particular map is that nobody's immune. It's everywhere. And it's in places that have never had major drug problems before. So your sheriff's department may never have had a major heroin issue in your county. And so they aren't organized to deal with it. And all of a sudden they find they have a whole new class of people who are becoming addicted and living right in their county. If you look at what the naloxone injections have been, well, if you go back to 2017, that's what it looked like. And then if you look at since 2014, there is hardly a place in Indiana that hasn't experienced a major eruption of the opioid epidemic. Now, where it affects you is county officials. It's going to affect your employees, and it's going to tend to be affecting people who do physical jobs for you. Anybody who does emergency services, your police, streets and roads, or anybody who does a lot of heavy lifting or physical labor is likely to get hurt. And they get hurt on the job, and some of these injuries are really painful. They get opioids in a very legitimate way, and a certain number of them are going to become addicted. And they're still your employees. And the thing that's significant about that is the people, many of the people getting addicted to opioids are not your typical drug users. They're just ordinary folks like you and me who had something happen, an injury on the job, or maybe a sports injury off the job, or an accident, and they're legitimately given a drug, and all of a sudden they find that they're addicted to it. The people, as a result, that are affected by opioids aren't your stereotypical junkies. They're people who look just like you and me. They function just like you and me until their use catches up with them. The risk impact for counties comes in a number of ways, and certainly in the insurance area. Workers' compensation, you have people getting hurt, you got getting opioids, that tends to make them less reliable workers. It makes potentially, there are places in the country where the plaintiff's bar is trying to blame now the employer and the workers' compensation carriers for having paid for the medical services that they're obligated to give their employees when they get hurt on the job. Indiana is not a real liberal state when it comes to that kind of a lawsuit, and it's starting out in places like California, but when the money starts to flow, that kind of a legal precedent starts to spread. In terms of liability, one of your big issues is you run the jails. And oftentimes people who are addicted to opioids end up in jail, either because they get into wrecks and they're intoxicated, or their doctor cuts them off in their prescription and now they're using illegal opioids and maybe paying for them by distributing them illegally. And of course, your automobile liability issues are you have drivers that are intoxicated, get into wrecks. The one area we're really concerned about is jails. You know, a lot of people think of the U.S. Department of Defense as always wanting more money, and they generally do. They go to the Congress and always they're saying, well, we need more money. And maybe the sheriff's departments do that a bit too. But this time, you need to be paying attention because they do have needs that are going to need more funding than historically they've had in the past. And some of these needs are expensive. They're going to need increased staff costs. There's a need for additional facilities because, as you heard by show of hands last night, a lot of people are thinking about building new jails because they're filling up. The medical costs inside jails are rising, and alarmingly, suicide rates are up. This is a graph of Indiana jail deaths for all causes in the last 5+ years. 84 people by our database, and we get our database by using internet search engines that go out and look for reports of people dying inside of Indiana jails. And of course, we insure a lot of Indiana jails, so we know about those firsthand. We had in jails we insure, we had 5 suicides in August, just in 1 month. Now that's an unusual cluster, but that's a lot of people. And whenever anybody dies in your jail, there's a real high probability that there's going to be a lawsuit follow. And a lot of those lawsuits are defensible, but a lot of those lawsuits cost between $100,000 and $200,000 to defend. So it is a very big deal. Of the 84 that we know of, the Bureau of Justice Statistics would indicate that the suicide rate for people in custody in Indiana is higher in the jails, but their numbers are not very current. But prior to 2014 and prior, they were indicating a trend of around 20 people a year dying in Indiana jails. This is a slightly lower, in the earlier years, slightly lower in the 2014 and 13 era, but now our statistics are indicating that it's over 20. It's an evolving problem, and it's evolving because suicide patterns in jails are changing from what they were before the opioid crisis. You're getting a lot of people in jails with opioid-related legal issues that are not experienced at drug use. Now, if you have typical drug users, there's a certain skill set that people acquire if they're adept at being a drug addict. And if they aren't adept at it, they're dead. So they develop certain kinds of skills and experiences, and they're kind of good at being drug users. Things like how do you go through withdrawal? And when do you know that you're physically in trouble when you're going through withdrawal? Now, those two kinds of things are really important because when you go into jail, you go into withdrawal because they don't let you take your drugs with you. And people who are not experienced at it don't know what to do. They don't know what's happening to them. And lots of times they die simply because they don't know to ask for help. The suicide rate, the suicide patterns are changing because many of the people that are going to jail as a result of opioids are people who have never been in trouble with the law. They're ordinary people who just got kind of hooked into this thing by accident. And as a result, the social shame of being in jail is very high. And the isolation from their normal support systems makes it very difficult time to be in jail. And as a result, within the first couple of days of being incarcerated is a high risk period for suicides. When they get a call from family over the jail phone, adjacent to that call is a high risk state for suicide. Before and after they go to court for the first time, when it's inescapable to them that they are now in the system and they're likely to stay in the system, is another time for suicide. And then the physical effects of withdrawing from opioids has several physical stages that last over the months, and each of those stages, as they transition to another one, is a time when they might be vulnerable to suicide. Now, the problem with that, I mean, there are lots of problems with it, but from a jailer standpoint, the problem is there's not enough suicide watch cells. I mean, those are special cells for people where people are put, where they can be put on a special watch that meets federal government standards and standards developed in case law for caring for prisoners. And yet we find lots of situations where people are put in ordinary jail cells because there's not enough of either the padded cells or the suicide prevention cells because they're already full. Staff is going to have to be trained in ways they haven't been trained before to do better screening on the front end regarding suicide risk. And they're also going to have to be better trained to be on suicide watch. I mean, you kind of have to become medical experts in a very narrow field of drug addiction in order to show and to be able to prove when the suits come that they either didn't violate the person's constitutional rights by negligence or they can survive a claim of deliberate indifference to the fact that the person might die. And it's quite possible that the kind of person that is going to be a correction officer is going to have to be a better educated person than is often the case in the corrections field. And that's because you're expecting a lot more of them. They have to understand, they have to acquire knowledge, and they have to apply knowledge, and they have to make important decisions. And that means that the staffing costs for jails is likely to go up. So there's absolutely no good news on the opioid front. As the government is cracking down on legal opioids, there's illegal opioids being smuggled into the country. Some of them are legitimate, some of them are knockoffs, some are heroin laced with fentanyl. Fentanyl was just today, the government released a study that said it's now the most deadly of the drugs that are in circulation, and it's being mixed with heroin, and a lot of the victims of these things, of these illegal drugs, are former people who got legitimate opioid prescriptions who now are cut off. And one last thing that happens too, and it isn't the county's fault, but it's certainly within the county's purview. A person who's been addicted to opioids has been put into jail for a time and then becomes detoxed because they've gone through withdrawal in jail, leaves jail. If they go back out and try to take the dose they were taking that got them into jail, they've lost their tolerance, and oftentimes it'll kill them. So it's a very, very difficult problem. It's not going to be a cheap problem. It's going to be an expensive problem. And it's going to add to the litigation that happens against counties because you guys own the jails. The next part of our presentation is going to be a little happier. You're all taking office either for the first time or a new office for the first time. And one of the things that invariably comes up is I got elected to this office because I had a vision for what I wanted to do, and I'd like to have my own team to do it with. What are the rules in terms of who can I fire and why? So Libby's going to be talking about that. If I can get this to work for us.